Good morning and welcome to this week's episode of the Midweek Mini. I'm your host, Andrea. Now, I think it's safe to say that we've all had that feeling that someone is following us or somebody is watching us. But what happens when that feeling goes from a hunch to a dangerous obsession? Well, that's what we're talking about today on this week's Midweek Mini.
Triple M Studios proudly presents Midweek Minis, and here's your host, Andrea Lee.
MaryLynn Witherspoon was what everyone who knew her described as the perfect Southern belle. She had always been the first one to volunteer to help in any way she could. She had a heart of gold, and those traits that she had followed her into her career as a teacher. Well, MaryLynn married a doctor soon after college graduation, and together the couple had a daughter named Jane. But that marriage wasn't to last, and after a few years of marriage, the couple divorced. A few years after the divorce, MaryLynn started dating a prominent Charleston lawyer named Edmunds Tennant Brown III. Edmunds had previously been married as well, and he had 2 children. One of those children was a son named Edmunds Tennant Brown IV, but he went by the name Tennant. Now, he also had a daughter named Molly. Now, Tennant was 10 years old when his father started dating MaryLynn in 1981. Edmunds and MaryLynn's daughter really hit it off, and they seemed to get along just great, even better than he got along with his own children. And this caused a little bit of tension because his daughter, Molly, she resented all that, and I can kind of understand how that would cause, some hard feelings. But anyway, now Edmunds, he did propose marriage several times throughout the relationship, but MaryLynn didn't think it would be a great idea because of that tension from Molly. There was also the fact that Tennant was a bit of an odd duck. He was socially awkward, but despite that, and being the sweetheart of a person that MaryLynn was, she tried extra hard to show Tennant extra attention and include him in all of the family type activities that they did. Tennant seemed to latch on in an odd way to MaryLynn, and it made her very uncomfortable. After being in the relationship for about 8 years, MaryLynn ended it, and this was a bigger blow to Tennant than it was his father. And Tennant was 18 years old when the couple broke up, but it was almost as if he was reliving his parents' divorce all over again. Not long after that, Tennant would start showing up at MaryLynn's house on Trad Street unannounced for no reason. Like, he would just come over and just stand there in her house. Now, can we say creepy? Well, even though MaryLynn found this behavior odd, it didn't frighten her. She'd known him since he was 10 years old, and she knew that he lacked social graces. She thought maybe he had a little crush on her, and that's why he was behaving so oddly. Still, she really thought nothing of it because she didn't see him as a threat. In 1989, MaryLynn went to stay with her mom in Sumter for just a little while, and things got a little weird while she was there. After she and her mom had went out for the day, they returned to find that her mom's home had been broken into. Nothing was missing, so that eased their minds, or at least for a little while it did. But once she got back home in Charleston and started unpacking from her trip, she realized that some of her clothes and makeup was missing. When she told her mom about it, her mom just knew right away that Tennant was responsible for the missing items. MaryLynn's mom was so sure that he had taken her daughter's belongings that she called him and told him that he needed to return them to MaryLynn ASAP. Well, guess what happened? A few days after that, a bag mysteriously shows up in MaryLynn's garage, and the contents were the missing items. Now, MaryLynn could see that Tennant's behavior was getting more alarming, but she still refused to call the police on him. Well, in 1991, Tennant's visits just stopped. So MaryLynn sighed a breath of relief and started going back to a normal life. But when Tennant was 30, he showed back up. And the fact that he was now a man made his behavior even more threatening, or it seemed more threatening. But she still didn't call law enforcement. So his showing up at random basically continued. One day in 2003, while MaryLynn was doing laundry, she realized that every single pair of her underwear that she owned was missing. All of them. And of course she knew that Tennant was the only one who could be to blame for this. And even then, she still didn't file a police report. Now, some of you may think that MaryLynn should have taken action about all of this happening, and just maybe it would have been, nipped in the bud a long time ago. You can't shame a victim. And knowing that MaryLynn was the kindest, most trusting person, then she would have never thought that it would escalate the way that it did. Now, she was proactive, though. She did have this alarm system installed in her house, and she also carried mace, and she had a panic button on her keyring. So she really did try to stay safe. She also had a couple of friends who were cops, so she mentioned the situation, and they told her that they'd keep an eye on things. One afternoon, MaryLynn caught Tennant standing in her backyard, and he was holding a pillowcase full of her clothes. Well, since he got caught, I'm sorry, y'all, I'm dealing with vertigo again, and I do apologize. I just didn't want to not do an episode today. But anyway, since he got caught, you would think that he'd have, hightailed it out of there. But no, he stood staring at MaryLynn, and the stare was bone-chilling to say the least. One of her sisters told her that she was afraid for MaryLynn's life, and that she really did need to call the police. But at that point, MaryLynn was more afraid of how Tennant would react if she did call the police and got them involved. Well, finally her friends and family pressuring her constantly, she finally decided to report against him. He was arrested and charged with burglary. Now, MaryLynn did feel some relief knowing that Tennant was in jail, but she knew that he wouldn't be in there long. So she registered with this system called Vine. It's a system that notifies the victim when their perpetrator is being transferred or released from jail. And she thought by doing this, she would know exactly when he was being released, and she'd have time to prepare herself. This was a good thing, she thought. Well, on November the 14th, 2003, MaryLynn didn't show up for work, and this wasn't like her at all. The principal and a co-worker from the school she taught at drove to her home to check on her. When they got there, nothing looked out of place, and MaryLynn's car wasn't there, but they just couldn't ignore the fact that something didn't feel right. So they called MaryLynn's daughter, Jane. Jane was living in Rock Hill at the time, which is about 3 hours away from Charleston. And when they told her, what was going on, she knew something wasn't right. So she and her husband headed straight for Charleston. She gave the police permission to go ahead and enter her mother's home without her being there. And when they entered the house, they immediately knew something was just not right. Something was terribly wrong. A lot of things are out of place, like a half-eaten apple laying by the front door. And as they went through the home, the scene didn't get any better. Upstairs in MaryLynn's sitting room, it looked like a bomb had went off, and MaryLynn was known for keeping a very neat house. When they entered MaryLynn's bathroom, they found her naked body laying in a bathtub. Her hands and feet had been tied, and she had also been raped and strangled to death. All of MaryLynn's friends and family immediately knew that Tennant had to be responsible for this, and Jane had even told the police that despite the fact that she thought he was still in jail. But they all would soon learn that only 3 months after being arrested for the burglary, Tennant had been released. But wasn't MaryLynn supposed to be notified when he was released? Well, apparently the wrong information was put into the system, and they tried to call 3 times, but they didn't have the correct number. But when they couldn't reach her by phone, they were supposed to send a letter to her home, and they did. But it arrived in her mailbox the day after she was murdered. When authorities realized that Tennant was no longer in jail, they started passing around a picture of him to hopefully locate him. And then they soon realized that he had been the same man seen walking around the neighborhood talking to MaryLynn's neighbors while police were there at her house. Well, they decided to make it kind of look like they had left just to see if he would show back up. And sure enough, he did show up a little later to the scene. And when they started questioning him, he decided he needed a lawyer. But get this, he was walking around with MaryLynn's keys. So they were able to arrest him right away. Now, as they were booking him into jail, they noticed that his brand new driver's license listed his address as MaryLynn's address. And not only that, he was wearing MaryLynn's clothes. Now, when MaryLynn's car was recovered, they discovered a piece of paper where Tennant had been refining his skills at writing MaryLynn's signature. But it gets weirder. A few days after MaryLynn died, a package arrived on MaryLynn's doorstep. It contained breast forms, a blonde wig, and makeup. Now, the weird part isn't that he wanted to dress like a female. I mean, that's fine with me. Y'all, I have no problem with that, and it's really not my business. But he ordered these items with MaryLynn's credit card, y'all. And his plan was to take over her life. So basically, he murdered her and was going to become her. DNA evidence did prove that Tennant had raped and murdered MaryLynn Witherspoon. Later, police located a notebook that Tennant had kept when he was in jail for the burglary. And every single day he wrote in it about his plan to murder MaryLynn and take over her life. He pled guilty to MaryLynn's murder. And because her family didn't want to be dragged through her murder trial for a second time, like all the details and everything, they opted out of a court trial. Tennant was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of MaryLynn Witherspoon. But still, MaryLynn's family was beyond mad at all the system screw-ups that led to her murder. And in 2005, her sister Jackie wrote a letter to the South Carolina Congress and gave the details of her sister's case. Well, they acknowledged that something had to change. And MaryLynn's law was signed into law by who was governor then, and that was Mark Sanford. Following that, MaryLynn's family sued the Charleston County Sheriff's Department for its faulty system that should have prevented MaryLynn's murder. It's just terribly sad that a life ended so tragically when it very well could have been prevented if it hadn't been for a glitch in the system. And then there's another case that happened on February 15th, 2020, and it was in the Hollywood Hills area. A well-known sex therapist was murdered by an ex. She was 38-year-old Amie Harwick. Previously, Amie had filed restraining orders against her ex-boyfriend, Gareth Pursehouse. The most recent of those 2 restraining orders had just expired right before the tragic homicide took place. Apparently, the 2 had dated and lived together for a short time before that relationship fell apart. Friends say that she was afraid of him and had even told her friends that she was considering carrying mace or pepper spray. Court records obtained by the New York Daily showed that details had given her, that she had given, when she filed for the restraining order, said that Pursehouse had previously choked her, suffocated her, pushed her against walls, kicked her, dropped her to the ground with force restrained her, slammed her head into the ground, and punched her with a closed fist. She had filed for the first restraining order after he had allegedly pushed her from a car. He also had broken into her apartment several times, and one particular time he smashed 10 picture frames against the door and told her that things would get much worse. But then he returned the next day to apologize and taped like 4 dozen roses to the entrance of her home. About a month before she was killed, Amie ran into Pursehouse at an event, and this seemed to reignite the obsession that he had with her. Amie later told a friend that when he saw her there, he went ballistic, and he made a scene right there at the event they were at. Another friend witnessed the behavior at the event and said that he, quote, went batshit crazy and that he was yelling and screaming, end quote. In the early morning hours of the murder, police responded to a call about a woman screaming, and when they arrived, they found Amie's roommate outside who said they had escaped the apartment and came outside to call for help because Amie was being assaulted inside the apartment. Soon after they arrived, they found Amie's body lying on the ground under her 3rd floor balcony. Like, I guess she dropped straight down. But anyway, she died later at the hospital. Pursehouse was arrested on February 18th on suspicion of murder and released on a $2 million bond. But he was rearrested just a few days later and charged with murder, along with charges of first-degree residential burglary, with special circumstances of lying in wait, and that makes him eligible for the death penalty. Pursehouse entered a guilty plea, or a not guilty plea, sorry about that, a not guilty plea. But so far he hasn't went to trial, and once that is all settled, I'll give an update on that case. Now, as you can see from both of these cases that we've talked about today, both victims knew their stalkers. Neither of the men involved were just some random person for either of these women. I think the biggest issue when it comes to stalking cases is that the laws aren't strict enough, and that's even if the state in question has any stalking laws. Fortunately, when Amie Lynn's law was signed into law, it made changes in how, stalkings are handled. And if you wanted to criticize MaryLynn for not filing reports with the police and getting a restraining order against tenant, I hope that Amie's case opens your eyes. When someone has ill intentions toward another person, they really don't care about a piece of paper. Not one time that I could find has any stalker been served with those papers and thought, oh gee, I guess I'll stop now. And in both of these cases, I read that both Tennant and Gareth had mental health issues. Sorry about that. And I'm not saying that's an excuse by any means, but a piece of paper definitely didn't or wouldn't have made a difference to them. Unfortunately, no amount of stricter laws or harsher punishments are going to totally stop stalking. Evil will always exist. Mental health issues will always exist. That's all I have for today's episode. Be sure to come back on Friday for an all-new episode of What the Friday, and on Saturday for the Weekend Weird Files. Have a good rest of your week.